Hello, students, and welcome to this fun interview series with professionals that you're going to have throughout the semester. And this is actually the first one that you're listening to today. And I couldn't be more excited to have the, well, now past president of the Denver IIA chapter. She has given over her reins to someone new, but for the last couple of years, she has been president. She has done so much work for our Institute of Internal Auditors Denver chapter that I'm super excited that she's going to talk to you today about the big picture of internal audit, which we at MSU now call risk assurance and advisory. Before we dive into that topic specifically, I'd love to have Jennifer just tell you about herself, introduce herself, tell us about her education, career background, and then maybe one fun fact if she has one.
Hi, Joe, and thanks for having me on this series. Yeah, it's really interesting how I got into internal audit because my background is accounting. So I have my bachelor's of accounting, and maybe I could use a fun fact is I don't have my CPA because I never passed the CPA. I got 3 parts and then the 4th one I couldn't pass. So I don't know how that encouraging that is for your students, but we're hopefully talking to future internal auditors.
Yeah, there you go.
So I ended up at the University of Texas Medical Branch, and I saw that there was several positions opened in internal audit. And in the meantime, before I could get one of those positions to get my foot in the door, I worked for the Department of Anesthesiology. So I was an admin for the Department of Anesthesiology, just waiting for that internal audit role to come open. And after a year it did. And that's how I got my foot in the door with internal audit. I spent 7 years with them and then moved on up into an oil and gas company because I was in Texas at the time and was 20 years, went from an internal audit manager all the way up to VP of internal audit.
Awesome, man, it goes by like that, doesn't it? 20 years.
I know when you start saying it over.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like, yes, I'm old. Yes.
Well, see, now I get to learn something new about you. I had no idea that you started in anesthesia. I can't even say the word.
Try to spell it. That was the worst.
Yeah, okay,
I learned how to spell it.
All right, so I think you really did your whole education background fun fact, but where do you work now? Tell the students a little bit about OmniTrack.
So yeah, after I left the oil and gas industry, I thought about retiring, but that lasted for a year. And OmniTrax was 5 blocks from my house. And I happened to be at a happy hour one night, and a guy was like, yeah, there's so many openings in accounting and this weird position called internal controls that we don't really know what they do. And I was like, oh, I know internal controls. And so I got him to vouch for me because, the old dogs don't typically get new positions. And he was like, no, she's just looking for something to do and to help out. And that's how I got here at OmniTrax, which we're the holder of 35 short line railroads. So it's a brand new experience for me. But I think just being of a background of internal audit and always asking questions, it's been very easy for me to kind of blend in and just be like, oh, how do you do this? And how do you do that?
Learn. I love it. So constant learning, I'm sure even in your career now. I think that, one thing I want the student to hear is how you would describe internal audit to somebody, maybe at happy hour, that knows nothing about it. So now, and by the way, students, that was a great little tip that she snuck in there, that always be on your best behavior, even at happy hour, because you never know when you're going to get a job out of it. But if you were at happy hour and you had to describe what we do as internal auditors, what would you say? How would you describe it?
I mean, I can put it very basic, which I do like putting things in terms that a 5-year-old can understand. That's always been one of my tips and tricks is if they can't explain it to you or a 5-year-old will understand it, they probably don't understand it. So I would describe internal audit as an assurance function that, we make sure that we provide assurance to the executives as to whether the controls that are in place and what they're expecting to happen actually happen. So it doesn't necessarily have to be with respect to a control or to the financials, but it's just kind of giving them a peace of mind that, my controller's telling me that they're doing this. Are we really doing that? Are the bank recs being performed? are these cost savings initiatives that they're telling me about, are they real? Can they be supported? And so I find that we're in both assurance, but I hate always being the compliance person. So I like more consulting, which I feel like internal controls people can do that as well.
Yeah, so I think that, so you hit the first part. So risk assurance and advisory, I always explain as being an internal consultant. So literally, you want them to be able to pick up the phone and call you and want advice as they are thinking about implementing a new system or changing the way they do a reconciliation, or, that's where I feel like we know we've done really well. Because this is all about big picture, right? Internal audit. And I always say, you're successful as an internal auditor or a risk assurance advisor if they are beating a path to your door, if they are on the phone and calling you. So I do think, yeah, there's kind of those two sides to what we get to do, providing that assurance on what is already done, and then providing advice on what maybe hasn't happened yet. So it's kind of
No, I do. I absolutely agree with you on that. When you have people coming to you and asking you to do things as an internal auditor, you know you've made it.
Yes. Yeah. Well, the current definition of internal audit is pretty much what we've talked about. It's that we provide assurance and consulting activities designed to add value and to improve an organization's operations. So that's the definition that I have memorized just today. But I like to make up more fun, like mission statements for internal audit. And so I sometimes work with different internal audit departments on creating one. Do you have one, or do you have kind of a mission or a philosophy that you have being a VP of audit?
I don't have one here at OmniTrax. We're a private company, so we're not required to do SOX per se. But being in a public company for 20 years, I would define it as, and this is not going to be verbatim, but being independent and objective and doing reviews of processes, procedures, and other various activities within the organization in order to, also based on risk. So I would say that too. It should be based on risk. You're not going to go do something that is low value add or low risk. So based on risk, that would provide some sort of assurance to your stakeholders.
Yep, I love it. So it's kind of, there's so many different ways to say what we do, but I love that you threw in risk-based, because that's going to be a term the students are going to get familiar with as we go through the semester. They're going to learn about risks first, really, and how to even come up with risks in their own lives. And then we're going to talk about what risk-based auditing really looks like, and putting together a risk assessment and all those good things. So that will come up lots. So I like that you added that in. So we've kind of already started touching on the different types of projects that we can do, like assurance. You mentioned compliance. So would you mind maybe expanding a little bit on what a compliance engagement would really look like? And then what other types? So I always like to say, system development monitoring, like project monitoring, or change in implementation. We used to have some little projects that they were, restructuring a group within the department. So what types of different, I always call them engagements instead of audits. What types of engagements do you do now, or have you done in previous careers?
Currently, I'm definitely more on the consultant side. So I'm doing almost purely special projects. So implementation of new processes. So when we find that a process is broken or needs to be more efficient, I come in and by asking questions and documenting things kind of can open it up to, especially when you don't know about the process and you come in, sometimes your questions can prompt a person that's looked at the process for the last 20 years to think differently.
Yeah.
Because most of my compliance is only towards the end of the year. And when I guess the way I describe compliance would be the controls. Yeah. And so I do a lot of walkthroughs for our independent auditors. I do the internal controls walkthroughs for the controls that they would like to see. And I document them and hand them over. So I consider that a compliance. I like the one you mentioned, because I haven't done this one in a while, but when I worked for the University of Texas Medical Branch, we had cost savings initiatives that had to go up through the UT system. So all the way up to the top of the university system. And what we as auditors would do was confirm that those were going to be true savings and that they could be reaped and that we could monitor and measure them. So I've done that as a special project. And then system implementations, it's always good if you're involved in a system implementation to make sure the controls are put in place up front versus having to come back in the end and say, well, that's not a good control. And system controls, as you know, and you will probably talk about, are the best controls.
Yeah,
In my
absolutely.
mind.
They come first, right? Before the
Yeah.
people control. Yeah, absolutely. No, I love all those examples. I think of controls and compliance too. I mean, SOX testing, which you all will learn about this semester, control testing, internal controls. That's, we're going to come in and make sure people are doing those right. And that's checking the compliance with those, right? So it could be compliance with a policy, compliance with a regulation. So depending on the industry you work in, you're going to have either more compliance work or less, probably. So financial services is an example where they have a lot of regulations that they have to follow in banking and financial services. And so a lot of times you'll have a separate compliance auditor function, even separate from internal audit as an operational function. And that's, you all are just learning about kind of what is internal audit, and I want you to see the breadth of all the things that we can do as internal audit. So it's great that Jennifer is a little bit, I'd say a little bit unique right now in your position, that you get to do a lot more of that consulting, which is kind of the fun stuff that we get to do. And I would consider that stuff actually the add value to the organization. I think a lot of what we do, even the assurance work, adds value. But like Jennifer said, what's the point in coming in after something's done and telling them it's wrong when you can point out along the way how to make things better? And so I always like that proactive approach. And I think that helps us add even more value. But Jennifer, what would you say is, the best way that internal auditors add value to their organization?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm going to have to go with, even though it's redundant to say the same thing, is that making sure that you put the controls in place and are reviewing those processes and procedures up front is one. Two, every organization is different. So you have to go and kind of flow with your organization. At the time, at one point in time, we needed to put better controls in place, and the external auditors had found a material weakness. So as an internal auditor, the value add at that time was for us to come in and kind of sort through all the data for this material weakness and help our external auditors through that. So I think you kind of have to find what your organization's needs are at the time and be that value add for them. You definitely have to take a guide from them as opposed to telling them what you think their value add. I can be value add if I test your controls.
Yeah, right.
So I find it very much where you are and where you are in your life cycle of the organization.
Yes, I love that. And I think one of the great examples of that was the pandemic. And a lot of internal auditors had to shift gears between their traditional audit work and what the organization needed help with at that time. They needed some assurance on people going remote, and they needed different types of activities out of internal auditors, and the best audit departments shifted. So I think you're spot on. To add value, you've got to keep up. I always call it just-in-time auditing, like just-in-time manufacturing.
That's a good point.
It's just, you got to do the right thing at the right time in the right place with the right people. And that's just really critical to continue thinking about that. So maybe this is a little plug for agile auditing that we'll talk about later in another interview later on. So is this very kind of a similar question? Is there anything that you think makes an internal audit department stand out within an organization? Or is it kind of everything we've been talking about? I don't know if there's any other things you can think of. I'm asking the same question like 4 ways, I know, but.
I think when in the boom days of SOX, when I had a rather large department in my previous life, I always kind of encouraged my staff, to not be the cop. It's a cop or consultant. Don't be the cop. Don't be the gotcha. Don't be the look what I found. Be the, more humble person that says, hey, did you realize that this happened over here? Is this what you expected? And so I think that having a personality of not being the gotcha type person in an internal audit function is beneficial for that function to then be called upon at a later date and time, because they are not embarrassed to come to you and be like, Jennifer, look what I did. Help me figure this out.
Right.
I'd rather them do that than me got them in the end.
Yeah.
So I always valued that approach for an auditor.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. I say don't be a cop, be a crossing guard. That's my new analogy. So
Okay, yeah,
we're helping organizations from point A to point B. We want them to improve, and so that's my new analogy that I've been using, but is spot on with what you just said. So thank you. I have one last question, which I am asking everybody in this series, which is, if you could give these students one piece of advice, personally, professionally, it could be audit related or not, what would you tell them?
probably in the same lines of what we just started talking about is, be humble, be vulnerable, have the ability to ask questions without acting as if you know it all. Please don't be a know-it-all.
I love it.
This is one thing. This is one thing that doesn't go over well with people.
That's true. And especially auditors that act like they know everything.
Yes.
So yes, being vulnerable and saying, I just, I didn't get, can you explain to me in like one other way? I'm so sorry. Like, I just didn't get it. And, I always say, laugh at yourself
Yeah,
sometimes. Yeah, too, right? Like, I think that them knowing that you're human, and this goes for anything, not just auditors,
sure.
just people knowing you're human. And I love that word, vulnerability. So thank you for
I
that.
I often, and sometimes I get responses. I often tell people, I'm like, I'm not as smart as you. Can you slow down and explain it slower?
Oh my gosh. I'm gonna
And
steal that. That's fantastic.
please forgive me. I'm sorry I'm not as smart as you. I need some help. Can you? And like you said, can you say that differently? That is another one that I've used. I'm like, or I repeat back what you say. And I was like, well, this is what I heard you say.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
but I think some people caught on that I might be smarter than I think I am when I say it, because they're like, come on, Jennifer, I know you do this. And I was like, maybe.
Just
And
checking, just
yeah,
double checking. I'm an
yeah,
auditor. I'm just double checking that I
I have to
understand.
confirm this.
Yeah. Well, and we're going on a tangent now, but one more thing. So I read a lot in Adam Grant's book, Think Again. He calls it confident humility. So, just really, just even embrace knowing what you don't know, and that's okay. And so I always really liked that. So there,
No,
I
that's good.
together just added, I think, a few tips of advice for the student. So, Jennifer, thank you so much for kind of kicking off this series with us and giving us what you think about internal audit. I think it shows the students a lot that you've been in it for this long, and you still
Still going.
you left retirement, which I know you said you were bored, but to come back to internal audit. So I think you're the perfect first guest for them. So thank you.
Well, thanks for having me.